What happens when a struggling single mother stands before a judge who listens not just to the law, but to her heart? In courtrooms across America, justice often feels cold and mechanical. Fines are issued, penalties imposed, and people leave feeling more broken than when they arrived. But in Providence, Rhode Island, one judge changed everything about how we think about justice and compassion. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Providence Municipal Court as Maria Santos walked through the heavy wooden doors, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled traffic citation. The courtroom buzzed with the usual activity: lawyers shuffling papers, clerks calling names, and defendants waiting nervously in wooden pews. But there was something different about this place, something in the air that set it apart from every other courthouse in America. At the bench sat Judge Frank Caprio, his silver hair catching the light, his kind eyes scanning the room with a warmth that seemed to wrap around everyone present. Unlike the stern, intimidating figures most people expected to encounter in court, Judge Caprio carried himself with a grandfatherly presence that immediately put people at ease. His reputation had spread far beyond Providence. Millions knew him as America's nicest judge, the man who brought humanity back to the halls of justice. Maria's case seemed straightforward enough: a parking ticket issued while she was rushing her sick child to the emergency room. The fine was modest by most standards, but for a single mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, it might as well have been $1,000. She had already missed work to appear in court, which meant another day without pay, another step closer to the financial edge she was already teetering on. As her name was called, Maria stood on unsteady legs, her heart pounding as she approached the bench. The fluorescent lights felt harsh against her tired face, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. This was it, the moment that would determine whether she could afford groceries this week, or would have to explain to her children why dinner was just rice and beans again. Judge Caprio looked down at the paperwork, then up at Maria, his expression softening as he took in her obvious distress. In most courts, this interaction would last less than 2 minutes. Guilty or not guilty, pay the fine, next case. But something in Maria's eyes caught the judge's attention, a story written in worry lines and sleepless nights that deserved to be heard. The courtroom fell unusually quiet as Judge Caprio set down his papers and leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am, before we discuss your citation, I want you to know that this is your courtroom too. Take a deep breath and tell me what happened that day." Maria's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness in his voice. She had prepared for judgment, for cold efficiency, for the grinding machinery of the legal system to chew her up and spit her out with another bill she couldn't afford to pay. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man who seemed genuinely interested in her story, her struggles, her humanity. No one in that courtroom, not the court officers, not the other defendants, not even Maria herself, expected what Judge Caprio would say next. But in that moment, as compassion met desperation in a Providence courthouse, something beautiful was about to unfold that would remind everyone present why justice should never be separated from mercy. Maria Santos had never imagined she would find herself standing before a judge, but life has a way of putting us in places we never expected to be. At 34, she was raising 3 children on her own after her husband's death in a construction accident 2 years earlier. The insurance settlement had barely covered the funeral costs, leaving Maria to navigate the impossible mathematics of single parenthood, making minimum wage stretch to cover rent, utilities, food, and everything else that comes with keeping a family afloat. Her days began at 5 a.m., getting the children ready for school before heading to her first job at a local diner where she served coffee and eggs to the morning rush. After her shift ended at 2 p.m., she would race to pick up her youngest from daycare, then head to her second job cleaning offices until late into the night. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, and rest was something she had learned to live without. On the day in question, Maria's middle child, 8-year-old Diego, had woken up with a fever that spiked to 104 degrees. Panic set in as she watched her son's eyes glaze over with delirium, his small body shaking with chills despite the summer heat. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to get him to the hospital immediately, and she scooped him up without thinking twice about anything else. The emergency room at Rhode Island Hospital was her destination, but finding a parking space proved nearly impossible. The lot was full, the street parking occupied, and Diego was getting worse by the minute. In desperation, Maria pulled into a spot marked for emergency vehicles only, her mind focused solely on getting her son the help he needed. She carried Diego through the automatic doors, his fevered head against her shoulder, and spent the next 6 hours in the pediatric ward as doctors worked to bring his temperature down. By the time they emerged, exhausted but relieved, Maria found the parking ticket tucked under her windshield wiper. The violation carried a fine that represented nearly a full day's wages from both of her jobs combined, money that was already allocated to her children's school supplies and her elderly mother's medication. But Maria didn't feel angry. She felt grateful that Diego was okay and resigned to the fact that this was just another financial hurdle she would have to figure out how to clear. Most judges would have simply glanced at the violation, perhaps noted the hospital location, and moved on to the standard fine or payment plan discussion. The system is designed for efficiency, not empathy, and Maria had prepared herself for exactly that kind of interaction. She had practiced explaining her situation in under 30 seconds, hoping to convey the impossibility of her circumstances without taking up too much of the court's valuable time. But Judge Caprio operated by different rules entirely. As Maria stood before him, he saw not just another parking violation, but a human being carrying invisible burdens that would break most people. He noticed the exhaustion in her posture, the way she held herself like someone who had learned to expect disappointment, the quiet dignity of someone who refused to be broken despite overwhelming circumstances. Most judges would simply read the fine and move on, one court observer would later reflect. But Judge Caprio leaned forward, looked into Maria's eyes, and asked a question no one expected. Instead of rushing through the case, he created space for her story, understanding that true justice requires seeing the person behind the paperwork. In that moment, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of being truly seen, of having someone in a position of authority recognize her not as a problem to be processed, but as a person worthy of compassion and understanding. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Caprio studied the case file, his weathered hands turning the pages slowly while Maria waited for the inevitable. She had been in this position before, standing before authority figures who held her family's financial stability in their hands, hoping for understanding but preparing for disappointment. The silence stretched on, filled with the weight of her expectations and fears. Then Judge Caprio did something that changed everything. He looked up from the papers, his eyes finding Maria's, and asked, "Tell me about your son. How is he doing now?" The question caught Maria completely off guard. In her experience with bureaucracy and government offices, no one had ever asked about her children except to verify names and ages for paperwork. No one had ever shown interest in their well-being beyond what was required by law. The unexpected kindness in Judge Caprio's voice broke something loose inside her, and the words began to flow. "He's okay now, Your Honor," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors said it was a severe virus, but they got his fever down. He's back in school." She paused, then added, "I know I shouldn't have parked there, but I was so scared. He was burning up, and I just needed to get him help." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his expression showing none of the impatience or judgment Maria had braced herself for. Instead, he asked another question that no one in the courtroom saw coming. "As a mother, what would you have done differently?" "Nothing," Maria replied without hesitation, her voice growing stronger. "I would do exactly the same thing again. My son needed help, and that was the only thing that mattered to me in that moment." "And that," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "is exactly what any good parent would do." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You know, I've been sitting on this bench for many years, and I've learned something important. The law isn't just about rules and penalties. It's about understanding why people make the choices they make, especially when they're protecting the people they love." The tension in the room shifted as Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his decision forming in real time. Maria could feel her heart pounding as she waited for his verdict, while everyone else in the courtroom seemed to sense They were witnessing something extraordinary. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said finally, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to embrace everyone present. "I'm not going to fine you for this violation. In fact, I'm going to dismiss this case entirely." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "What you did that day wasn't illegal parking. It was being a mother. And the last thing this court wants to do is punish someone for taking care of their child." Maria's legs nearly gave out beneath her as the words registered. She had prepared for a payment plan, for financial hardship, for another burden added to her already overwhelming load. Instead, she found herself receiving something she had never expected in a courtroom: justice tempered with compassion, law softened by understanding. But Judge Caprio had one more surprise. "Furthermore," he continued, reaching into his desk drawer, "I want you to have this." He pulled out a small envelope and handed it to a court officer to give to Maria. "It's a gift certificate to a local restaurant. Take your children out for dinner tonight, on the court." The silence that followed was profound. Maria stood frozen, the envelope in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of Judge Caprio's kindness settled over her. The courtroom had witnessed more than just a dismissed parking ticket. They had seen humanity triumph over bureaucracy, compassion conquer cold justice. In the days that followed Maria's appearance in Judge Caprio's courtroom, word of what transpired spread through Providence like ripples in still water. Court employees who had witnessed the interaction couldn't stop talking about it. Local news picked up the story. Social media amplified it across the country. But for Maria Santos, the impact was far more personal and profound than any viral moment could capture. That evening, as she sat in the restaurant with her 3 children, Diego, healthy and laughing, his siblings amazed that their mother had been treated with such kindness by a judge, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death: hope. Not just for her immediate circumstances, which remained challenging, but for the possibility that the world still contained people who saw beyond rules and regulations to the human heart beneath. Judge Caprio's decision that day represented everything he had spent decades trying to achieve on the bench. He had long believed that the law should serve humanity, not the other way around. His courtroom had become a place where justice wore a human face, where people's stories mattered as much as their violations, where compassion was considered an essential component of fair judgment rather than a weakness to be avoided. This wasn't an isolated incident in Judge Caprio's career. It was emblematic of an approach to justice that had made him beloved not just in Providence, but around the world. His television show, Caught in Providence, had introduced millions of viewers to a different vision of how courts could operate, one where understanding and empathy stood alongside law and order as fundamental principles of justice. The cases that came before Judge Caprio reflected the full spectrum of human struggle. Elderly people on fixed incomes facing fines they couldn't afford, veterans dealing with PTSD and homelessness, immigrants navigating an unfamiliar system while trying to build new lives, parents like Maria making impossible choices in desperate circumstances. In each case, Judge Caprio brought the same patient attention, the same willingness to see the person rather than just the paperwork. What made Judge Caprio remarkable wasn't just his kindness. Many judges are kind. It wasn't just his compassion. Many people in positions of authority care deeply about those who appear before them. What made him extraordinary was his understanding that justice without humanity is merely punishment, and that the true measure of a legal system isn't how efficiently it processes cases, but how effectively it serves the people it was created to protect. Maria's case became one of thousands that illustrated this principle in action. Each dismissed ticket, each payment plan adjusted to someone's actual circumstances, each moment of unexpected grace served as a reminder that the law is ultimately about people, their safety, their dignity, their ability to recover from mistakes and move forward with their lives. Judge Frank Caprio reminded us that justice isn't only about laws, it's about humanity. In a world that often feels harsh and unforgiving, he created a space where people could expect to be treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. His legacy lives on not just in the thousands of cases he handled with compassion, but in the example he set for how we might all treat each other with greater understanding and grace. This was just one case among many, but it perfectly captures why the world came to know him as America's nicest judge, and why his approach to justice will continue to inspire long after his retirement from the bench. Thank you for watching this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world.